Hello, welcome everyone. So great to see everybody coming in while we wait to admit everybody in the waiting room that's joining us. Feel free to put where you're from in the chat if you'd like. It's always fun to see the different areas that people are joining us from. I see so many people that I know that have been with us before. Some new faces. Oh, we're New Mexico, Maryland, Canada, Oregon, Seattle, Kentucky. That's wonderful. Provincetown, Massachusetts. Beautiful there. Homer, Alaska. That's great, isn't it?
Oh,
Morro Bay, California. Indiana, Quebec, Canada, Ontario. Jeez, this is fabulous. Look at this. We have over 200 people who have joined us so far from Alabama, Monterey, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, Michigan, Tasmania. You got to be kidding.
oh,
I don't know. That little
yeah.
smiley afterwards, I'm not sure. Ah, so good to see everybody joining us. I'm gonna get started, even though people are still coming in, just because we have a very special guest today, and I don't want to take any time away from the program. So I'm just gonna get going with a bit of an introduction. I'm Meg Weston. I'm founder and host of the Poets Corner and welcome back to our Sunday reading series. We have a special guest today, Arthur Sze, and I'm very excited to introduce him. But first, I'd like to just say a few words about the Poets Corner and our upcoming events. So, June marked the fifth anniversary of our founding. And I'd just like to take a moment to recognize that milestone. 5 years ago, I never imagined it would be the size and scale that it is today. I had just retired in January of 2020. And then in March, we were all suddenly sheltered in because of the spread of disease and COVID and all of our fear. And I was feeling pretty isolated. I wanted to do a deep dive into poetry. And I reached out to a writing friend, Catherine Seitz, and said, I'm thinking about starting an online poetry series on Zoom just so I can connect with other poets and have more of a sense of community. And she just jumped at the chance to join me in doing that. She contributed enthusiasm in abundance, as well as ideas and connections. But by the end of our first year, unfortunately, she fell victim to dementia and she became unable to manage the technology or other aspects of being a part of this adventure. I will always honor the energy she brought in the very beginning. It meant so much to me. And now, 5 years later, we have over 8,000 people in our community. And we've been doing this free run Sunday reading series for 60 months, including emerging writers as well as distinguished published poets such as we have with us today. My nephew, Lucas Adair, has been our incredibly competent technical host and wizard since the start. And this past year, I was joined by the very talented Liz Kallick as our strategy and design director. Liz and I have been cooking up all kinds of new things that will launch in 2026, and you'll hear more about that in the coming months. So we'll be quiet in August and then get going to a roaring start in September or restart in September. September 14th, we have a reading with Mark Doty, Diane Seuss, and Melissa McKinstry that we're calling In Conversation with Poets I Love, Past and Present. On September 21st, we have a craft talk on the lyric essay with Heidi Serwick. She wrote the original book on the craft of the lyric essay, and you'll really want to sign up for that if you're interested at all in this form. On September 23rd, in partnership with the Malay House Rockland, we'll be hosting Conversations with Dead Poets. 4 contemporary living poets and writers, and talking in conversation with 4 who have passed. Julia Bousma, the poet laureate of the state of Maine, and her work in conversation with Edna St. Vincent Millay. The poet Rosa Lane in conversation with Emily Dickinson's poems. Sama'a Abdurraqib talking about June Jordan, and A.O. Scott, the New York Times critic and writer, will be talking about Thomas Gunn. That is available. It will take place in person in Rockland, Maine, as well as online over Zoom on the Poets Corner, and you'll be able to sign up on thepoetscorner.org or malayhouserockland.org. In October, Jane Hirschfield will return for a solo reading, and we'll also launch our 5th annual Ekphrastic Challenge in partnership with Page Gallery. Their exhibition will be both online and in their gallery in Camden, and the selected poets will be reading on the Poets Corner in November, and also part of the first printed chapbook honoring that 5th anniversary. So there's much you won't want to miss on the Poets Corner, but I don't want to take a moment more away from today's program with Arthur Sze. He is the author of 12 books of poetry, including 2 released just this spring, Into the Hush from Copper Canyon and The White Orchard, selected interviews, essays, and poems from the Museum of New Mexico Press. His prior publications include The Glass Constellation, New and Collected Poems, which was selected for a 2024 National Book Foundation Science and Literature Award, and Sightlines, selected for the 2019 National Book Award. He also published The Silk Dragon 2, Translations of Chinese Poetry with Copper Canyon Press. His honors include 2024 Rebecca Johnson Bobbitt National Prize for Poetry from the Library of Congress, and also the Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize from the Poetry Foundation, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and many, many others. He was the first poet laureate of Santa Fe, New Mexico, as well as the chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. He's been a writer in residence at the Merwin Estate in Maui, Hawaii. He is currently a professor emeritus at the Institute of American Indian Arts, where he established the BFA degree program in creative writing. I could go on and on. This man is so accomplished and wonderful, to have him on the Poets Corner, but I'd rather hear him read and talk about his practice of poetry. So please join me in welcoming Arthur Sze.
Thank you, Megan. I want to thank everyone connected with the Poets Corner and all of you for being here this afternoon. You might hear some thunder in the background. We're having sporadic thunderstorm, lightning. Hopefully, I won't get interrupted. I'm going to begin by reading a selection of poems from Into the Hush, and then the title poem to my book of selected interviews and essays, The White Orchard. So this first poem is called Anvil. When a black butterfly flits past, when you glimpse the outlines of apple trees, when you smell the sprig of sunrise and walk up to the ditch, when bearing Aleut, Juma, Tuscarora join the list of vanished languages, when you turn a spigot and irrigate blossoming pear trees, when the time of your life is a time of earthquakes, when a woman hit by a car while crossing the street recovers then slides into pain, when a matsutake emerges out of the rubble of Hiroshima, when a bartender blows smoke rings and slips through hoops into his past, when foragers slice russulas, amanitas, clitosebes, and pursue red-capped boletes, when water slips through roots, rises through a trunk, streams into leaves, when in our bodies we sway and flood, when you bloody your hands, when the mind like this earth is struck and tilts its axis, when under summer stars you have built a cabin in the wilderness, when you gaze at Aldebaran and sense a first frost on the grass, when in our bodies we ride the waves of our earth, here is the anvil on which to hammer your days. This next poem is in the voice of a jaguar. It's called Jaguar Song. Just after you sign and envision building homes on this tract, you smell me in the dark. Know that I move through this terrain at night, though you only think of building and selling. Even now you believe you can borrow my spirit by wearing a mask of my face on your face. Look at me. Delve into your fears. Is your deepest fear to be hacked, strangled, or be strapped to an IV in a bed with no chance to die? I can grasp a turtle and break its shell with one bite. I can pounce on a deer and crush its skull and neck with my teeth. You slash and burn in the jungle, force the snakes and macaws to retreat. You even burn your own species alive. Look into my eyes. I am your mirror and transformer. If you destroy my species, I will shapeshift and hunt you in your dreams. The fingerprints of your hands resemble the black rosettes on my skin, and you will not escape. You will never comprehend the twin nights in my eyes. Remember, as a child, you came up the steps from the basement and flicking off the light at the top of the stairs, feared a hand about to grasp your shoulder from behind. That fear is alive. And now as you rummage for keys at your apartment doorstep, I am a passing jogger about to pounce. I am the creature who smells your darkest thoughts. And as you turn the key in the lock, day or night, out of the darkness, I spring. Vectors. First extinction in the Galapagos Islands, the least vermilion flycatcher. Hopis drill a foot deep and plant blue corn along a wash. Danger, a woman brushed on the side of a napalm bomb. In an oblong box emptied of firewood, a black widow web. Shaving, he nicked himself and stared in the mirror in a moment of blood. Out of a saddlebag, a teen pulls a severed goat's head. Before signing his name, he recalls hotel rooms were once used as torture chambers. In Thessaloniki, the beach attendant made a gun of his hand and fired at him. Prisoners cackled when the inmate on stage said, "Is it not time for my painkiller?" Weighing mushrooms, the Tibetan cashier grins. You suffer from suspicion. I suffer from kindness. A mercenary turned car mechanic spilled a pile of Krugerrands onto the table. Looking up from a tusk under the lamp, the carver smiled. It's butter in my hands. In New Mexico, we have a custom of at the end of the year of taking brown paper bags, putting sand in them, and lighting candles, and creating a series of a walkway with lit candles. They're called farolitos. Farolitos. We pour sand into brown lunch bags, then place a votive candle inside each. At night, lined along the driveway, the flickering lights form a spirit way. But what spirit? What way? We sight the flames and swaying within, know the future's fathomless. We grieve, yearn, joy, pinpoints in a greater darkness, and spy sunlight brighten craters on a half-lit moon. In this life, you may try to light a match, fail again and again. Yet, letting go, you strike a tip one more time when it bursts into flame. Now the flames are lights in bags again, and we glimpse the willow tips clutch at a lunar promise of spring. There's a New York architect, Stephen Hull, who has a practice of, before he starts developing a large architectural project, he has a practice of envisioning a small part of that space and making a watercolor. And so this next poem is an ekphrastic inspired by his work. It's called Architect's Watercolor. An architect draws a watercolor depicting two people about to enter a meeting room, while someone on the stairway gazes through windows at a park, river, skyscrapers beyond. He does not want to be locked like a carbon atom in a benzene ring, but needs to rotate, lift off, veer among wharves and shoreline. In the acoustics of this space, he catches a needle bounce off a black granite floor, wanders from a main walkway, encounters prickly pear burned purple in wind. In the ocean gusts before dawn, he yearns for a Mediterranean spray where sunlight tingles eyelashes, where sand releases heat under the stars. In the atrium, two violinists launch fireworks of sound that arc, explode, dissolve into threads of melodic charm. Here, slate near a pool of water absorbs sunlight, releases ripples into the evening, and in this space, each minute is encounter. He steps out and makes footprints on a sidewalk dusted with snow. Dawn branches. Owls hoot back and forth. Inside a pencil, peace waits to be written. Gunshots, blood cries in streets. Shouts ricochet in November moonlight. This is not about last things. Drawing a curve, he sees the graphite erode. He can never make an unending circle. This is about anticipation, your time on this planet, this stark branch, sapphire light, steel rake noise, this fern leaf ooze compressed, these carbonized griefs and hungers, lifting sounds out of the cauldron of silence. Branches of a golden rain tree emerge out of darkness. Downwind. When the air clears after days of smoke, you yearn to swim in an alpine lake that mirrors clouds and wash the scent of burned pines from your hair. From the west, smoke has traveled 1,000 miles, the point of ignition where a pine snapped a transmission line. When the air clears after days of smoke, you notice the serrated edges along apple leaves. Locate a point of ignition in a word, a jab. A man chalks a cue stick and slamming the white ball into a pyramid of balls, feels for a millisecond a point of ignition and surge in the clatter. When the air clears after days of smoke, you believe you are simply a casualty downwind. But as you hold a Rubik's Cube of time in your hands, the orange sunrise is nowhere, everywhere, and damn, the pieces are pieces you cannot flip back. For the first time, I wrote a couple of pantoums, and instead of having the quatrain, the four-line stanza, where the second and fourth line become the first and third line of the following stanza, I made a few adaptations to the form. I broke the quatrains into couplets, and then as I wrote the poem, the repetitions were a little predictable. So I suddenly had this idea of introducing a white space, a caesura inside of each line, so that the silence shifts the rhythm and the point of tension in each line. This is called Papyrus Pantoum. Coyotes surround a buck staggering in the snow. Under a rising moon, we step along a ridge of white sand. Sandhill cranes return in low V's and land in a cornfield. In Bolivia, they extract lithium out of altiplano salt flats. Under a rising moon, we step along a ridge of white sand. You burn me, torn off papyrus wrapped around a corpse. In Bolivia, they extract lithium out of altiplano salt flats. A claret cup cactus flowers among sandstone rubble. You burn me, torn off papyrus wrapped around a corpse. Rain makes quicksilver, strikes on the surface of a lake. A claret cup cactus flowers among sandstone rubble. In twilight we sway and surge into flame. Rain makes quicksilver strikes on the surface of a lake. Coyotes surround a buck staggering in the snow. In twilight we sway and surge into flame. Sandhill cranes return in low V's and land in a cornfield. So yeah, I think just a couple more poems. Let's see. I'm going to read. This one is called Wildfire Season. I think I'll read like 3 more. Wildfire Season. The wind stokes flames and they leap across the fire line. To the north, a jagged red and yellow ridge line crackles with billowing clouds of smoke. To the far north, a singer stretches walrus bladder and completing a box drum starts to hum. He nods as a song takes shape in his hands. The smallest subatomic particles trace the birth of the cosmos. Traces of scorpion venom will lead to new cures. One day they will extract heavy metals from the moon. The spider in a sink sips from a droplet of water. Leaf cutter ants will one day march across a radioactive forest. In this wind, pear trees unfold white blossoms, shape a song as time detonates inside of time. This next poem is from the book of selected interviews and essays. And one of the interviews that I do with the poet Eileen Tavios is looking at 88 different drafts of this poem. And it's a form that I've invented that I call a cascade. And rather than having, say, the beginning of each line of the poem repeat the same word, I wanted to use musicality or explore the possibility of musicality and repetition. So I gave myself the stricture of what happens if each line has a word or words that are picked up from the previous line, but not in any predictable location. A white orchard. Under a supermoon, you gaze into the orchard. A glass blower shapes a glowing orange mass into a horse. You step into a space where you once lived. Crushed mica glitters on plastered walls. A raccoon strolls in moonlight along the top of an adobe wall. Swimming in a pond, we noticed a reflected cottonwood on the water. Clang, a deer leaps over the gate. Every 15 minutes, an elephant is shot for its tusks. You mark a bleached, earless lizard against the snowfall of this white page. the skins of eggplants glistening in a garden, or bodies glistening by firelight. Those skunks once ravaged corn or bright moments cannot be ravaged. Sleeping near a canal, you hear lapping waves. At dawn, waves lapping, and the noise of men unloading scallops and shrimp. No noise of gunshots. You focus on the branches of 100-year-old apple trees. Opening the door, we find red and yellow rose petals scattered on our bed. Then light years. You see pear branches farther in the orchard as the moon rises, branches bending under the snow of this white page. And I'll close with, I'm coming back into the hush. I'll close with a poem called Swimming Laps. Swimming backstroke toward the far end of a pool in sunlight, yellow flares in the nearby aspens. In the pre-dawn sky, Mars and Venus glimmered. How is it a glimmering moment coalesces and the rest slides like flour through a sieve? How is it these glimmerings become constellations in a pre-dawn sky? Reaching the wall, I turn and push off swimming freestyle. How is it we bobbed in water beyond the breaking surf, and I taste that salt in my mouth now? How is it, disheveled, breathless, we drew each other up into flame? How is it that flame burns steadily within? Reaching the wall, I turn and push off swimming side stroke. With each scissors kick, I know time's shears. This is not pre-dawn to a battle where the air dips to a windless calm. Let each day be lived, risking, feeling, loving, alive to ivy reddening along the fence. Reaching the wall, I turn and push off swimming breaststroke. How is it I see below than above a horizon line? How is it I didn't sputter, slosh, end up staring at a Geiger counter clock mounted on a barroom wall? I, who have no answers, find glimmering shards. Reaching the wall, I pause, climb out of the pool, start a new day. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Oh, that was so wonderful. Oh, thank you, Arthur. I just this book, Into the Hush, I have to recommend that everybody buy it. The cover itself is gorgeous. The poems in it are so rich, and I love that many of my favorites were ones that you chose to read today. Thank you for ending with my request for the swimming laps poem. As a swimmer, I just love that poem and its embrace of life. So I'm going to just ask a few questions, start a conversation going, but I'm going to encourage people to put their questions into the chat, and at some point we'll break and start to introduce some of the people who have joined us and what's on their minds. But I want to start with one about this book. You've included, played with, invented, included a whole wide range of forms and different forms in the book. Haibun, Pantoum, I think something you've called the sequence, And I wonder what made you decide to do that in one collection, and what do you think that does for this particular book?
Um, Thank you. That's a wonderful question. It's sort of like, where do I start? I'm going to start by saying Into the Hush is my 12th book. And I like to think that each book has its own unique architecture or kind of inner necessity in the way that the poems unfold through the book. So, run through the book are 7 pairs of untitled sections where two people hold one calligraphy brush. It's called two-minded calligraphy. And they together have to learn to sort of synchronize their minds and bodies and create one Chinese character, which they, through the book, create. And that character is emptiness. So interspersed as a through line through the book. And this is a Japanese form that I've never used before called the zuihitsu. And the Japanese characters for zuihitsu are actually Chinese characters, kanji. And if you read Chinese, those two characters mean following the brush. So I had this wonderful idea of two people discovering through language certain patterns and movements and motions. And so that it didn't come till after 3 years of writing poems, working on this book. I didn't really know what I was doing other than writing from one poem to the next. But I got to the stage where I tried to envision, well, what is going on with these new poems and that Zuihitsu that I wrote. It was exciting for me to suddenly think, oh, it's not just a separate poem, but if I break up the 7 paired sections and run it through the book, it's like a way of working with language and creating. Of course, when emptiness is then completed, there's like a spilling out into fullness or the richness of the world. So that's a form I'd never used before. The pantoum I'd never used before. I think I did that because, again, this is my 12th book of poetry, and I didn't want to feel like I was repeating myself. I mean, every poet, every writer has, you have your obsessive themes, and you can't run from them. You have to really work through them, I think. But I don't want to feel like I'm repeating myself. And one way to make myself stretch was to ask myself, are there certain forms that I've never used before, and what would happen? And, if I invented a form, if I took the pantoum, and it wasn't preconceived. I thought, okay, I'll try a pantoum. They might be disasters. But as I wrote them and wrote them out in the 4-line stanzas, my lines were pretty long and they felt too packed. So then I broke them into couplets. And then I looked at the couplets and I thought the repetitions were too predictable. And then I thought, what do I do with this? And then I was excited to think, oh, if I use emptiness, if I create a caesura and I float it inside of each line, the repetitions are all there, the rules of the form are fulfilled. But because there's a silence, a pause that's unpredictable, that silence changes the rhythm and the tension of each line. So that was like my fun uh, variation or innovation on the form. And these were all like step-by-step things. I have two 14-line poems, and I hesitate to call them sonnets. They're not rhymed or metered, but one of them has the architecture of a Petrarchan sonnet, 8 lines, and then a turn with 6 lines. And the second 14-line poem is set in 3 quatrains with a concluding couplet. So it has a Shakespearean form behind it. I like little secrets to poems where they're not like blatant or obvious. They help me stretch and try things with language that I have never done before. So that for me was the value of trying these new forms. And I think there were a couple of forms I tried that didn't work at all, like a sestina. I couldn't, the repetitions were too difficult. Maybe I'll come back to it someday. So, but again, it was a way of working with language to ask myself, how can I shape this and in a way make it mine, but be part of this rich tradition and stretch the language.
I love that you're continually trying to stretch yourself and stretch the language, as you say. And the Jaguar poem, you call that, I think, a dramatic monologue? And is that a form that you've used in the past, or is that one new too?
Uh, in my book Sidelines in 2019, for the first time, I wrote two poems that were monologues. One's called Salt Song, and the other is called Lichen Song. And I did that really thinking about how so much of our poetry with the speaker of the I is, human. And then I thought, well, what if, a piece of lichen spoke, or what if a piece of salt spoke? And also because I have this, I guess, obsession with form, I thought rather than run it in traditional lines, if a piece of lichen or a piece of salt or a jaguar or an eraser, which is the poem I didn't read in Into the Hush, if they were given voice and had urgency behind them, what kind of shape would their language be? And I thought to myself, maybe they're like run-on sentences. They're like a prose poem with pauses, but it's just one continuous motion. So all four of those, I see them as a kind of a set. I wrote Salt Song and Lichen Song, and then I put it aside. And then a number of years later, as I was working on Into the Hush, I thought, well, I would like to try a living creature. And I thought, well, I'll try a jaguar. And then one day I was just rubbing out some pencil notes, and I thought, what if the eraser spoke? So, and I put them all inside of hyphens, inside of dashes. So it's like dash, this run-on sentence, and then a dash. So the whole thing is like a kind of aside, but it's kind of like this outburst. So I was just exploring voices other than a human person and what that entity, what that creature might say or speak, or and with urgency say to a living person.
Great explorations. I wanted to talk a little bit about juxtaposition in your poems. Like, I think a couple of people commented on that in the chat, but your poems often just juxtapose very different images from all over the world or other types of things, places and times. And when I first started to read this book, I wondered what is going on here, And then particularly as I read more of your work and more of your words in the interviews in The White Orchard, you introduced that concept of simultaneity. And I began to relax and just really enjoy what was happening here with these. I think somebody in the chat called them explosive juxtapositions. So I think the poem Vectors was a wonderful example of that. Would you talk a little bit more about what you're doing with that in your poems?
Sure. It's something that has sort of evolved over time. And I guess I'm giving you a long explanation, but since we have plenty of time,
Yes.
it's fun for me to have the opportunity to sort of enlarge on something like this. So I learned my craft through translating classical Chinese poetry. And with Chinese characters, when you learn to write them, one of the first things you immediately discover is that they accrue through juxtaposition. So if you write the character tree and you juxtapose tree to tree, left and right, you create the character forest. If you take the character sun and you juxtapose moon, you create the character bright. If you take the character field and below field, you write the character heart and mind, to put your heart and mind in the field. That is the character in Chinese to think. So, in working with ancient and classical Chinese poems, I thought about how Chinese is very, obviously such a different language from English and has invoking an image from science, almost like magnetism, these fields of energy with the things that are juxtaposed. And sometimes They reinforce each other like sun and moon. Sometimes they're in tension with each other. Sometimes they sort of are layered. So like if you write autumn and you write heart mind below it, and you put autumn in the heart, that's the word sorrow. So for me, it was a revelation to think, oh, in Chinese, if you write the character sorrow, you're creating a metaphor through juxtaposition. You're writing autumn, and then you're writing heart mind. And really, the sort of metaphor is sorrow is autumn in the heart and mind. But the is stripped away, and the metaphor is accomplished just by juxtaposition. So I was
Mm.
fascinated by that, and I think it really took me decades of exploring, and frankly, in my early 20s, the juxtapositions were sort of wild and unwieldy, and I think over time I got to a writing process where the writing process slowed down a lot. So I had to make a mess on the page and write lots of phrases and images, and then start to see which phrases or lines could come together like sun and moon, or could come together like autumn and the heart and mind, so that they weren't arbitrary, that there was some kind of inner necessity or subtext bringing these different things together. So I like to think like in vectors, this isn't just arbitrary. And the thing I want to add, I guess, is when people talk about juxtaposition in my poetry, they're often thinking of it as an artistic technique, surrealism or whatever, and that's fine, but it's not enough. In my opinion, juxtaposition over time, again, it's not like I intellectually saw this in my 20s, but over time, juxtaposition is a vision of our world. It's more than an artistic technique. And as you say, our world is so many worlds are in collision, and we live in a world that's much more simultaneous, where different worlds are pushing against or interacting with each other. So I'm not opposed to like linear narrative, a traditional narrative that can be very beautiful. And occasionally I write that kind of a poem, but I'm also interested in the kind of poem where different worlds are brought into interaction. And one world isn't necessarily more important or um, hierarchically more important than another. So, like in vectors, I probably had 20 or 30 of those one line stanzas. I call them monostichs. I think of them as like microcosms, but together or assembled or coordinated in the way that they unfold, a macrocosm can be created. So it took me maybe 2 months to write that short poem because I had maybe 50 or 60 one line stanzas, and then to sift down to what felt like important, essential lines and to have them interact with each other and to think where could the beginning be, where could the ending be. Writing is a much slower process for me now. So I write maybe only 10, if I write 10 to 12 poems a year, writing every day, that's great.
Wow.
Um,
And it sounds as if the process has shifted your worldview and your worldview has informed your poetry. Yeah.
I think it goes back and forth. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like that. Isn't that wonderful? And you mentioned the Chinese translation. You talked a lot about that. And I think I read in maybe in your interview with Esther Berlin that you taught your creative writing students through translation at the Institute of Indian Arts there, but that you also taught them with a sequence of prompts that really helped them develop their voice and get them going. And I wondered if you might share with us a little bit about how that worked and maybe a couple of the prompts that we.
Sure. Well, again, it's sort of an odd story. I stumbled into my job at the Institute of American Indian Arts. I was non-native, and I didn't have a graduate degree. So the president, when he hired me, laughed and said, I'm going to advertise a position with no benefits, with no guarantee of any classes. The Institute was part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at that time in 1984, 83 actually. And but I had visited the school. I really liked the Native American students. I thought it was an amazing place. They had amazing life experiences. And so I sort of got hired as a part-time instructor with no benefits and without any foreknowledge that 5 years later I would become the head of the creative writing program. There were huge budget cuts from Congress. It was federally funded. The Institute dropped to almost 90 students. It almost collapsed. And I talked to the dean. I was the only faculty member left in the English department and creative writing program. And I said, if you give me a chance, I can build this program. And the dean said, fine, we're going to let you rewrite the curriculum, hire all the faculty, take over the English department. You can do it all. Just take your time and do it. So as I redeveloped the 4-year undergraduate program, I thought to myself, well, I've taught the poetry workshop, and the first time I did it, I would tell students, oh, I'm not going to sign anything, just bring in whatever you're writing. And the poems were almost always dreadful from week to week. And it's like, oh my God, this is not going to work. They need some guidance. They need a way to develop some rigor, to really push their imagination, to use their native languages as well as English. And so I created a class called the Poetic Image, where I took Native American students character by character, poem by poem, through classical Chinese poems. So for instance, I would give them Li Bai's poem that Ezra Pound translated is The Jade Stare's Grievance. It's a poem in 20 characters. And I would write out the Chinese on a whiteboard. I would write out clusters of words in English under each Chinese character, explain what was going on in the poem. And then I would show the native students maybe 4 or 5 different translations in English. I would say, here's Ezra Pound's translation. Here is Witter Binner. Here is C.H. Guac and Vincent McHugh. Here are different versions. And we would talk about, just in the play of language, what seemed to work, what didn't seem to work, what seemed to be lost in translation. And so then I would tell the students, I want you to make your own translation of this poem into English or into your native language, or both. And they would do that. And then I would tell them, the next stage is, I want you to write a poem that you could only have written because you've made this translation. Meaning, what is it you learned doing this translation, making this translation from Chinese into English? What did it show you that you didn't know about or didn't foresee? And how can you use that in your own poetry? And so when I started to do writing prompts like that, I was amazed at what the native students did. And suddenly it was like, I hate giving writing prompts, but if they can write like this, it's worth it until they get to the stage where then later I just say, write whatever you want. But if I just started that way, the poems didn't get any better. So another thing I did was sort of anti-poetic. I Xeroxed the glossary of a book called Conceptual Astronomy, and it had 100 different terms, scientific terms of astronomy. And I said, okay, I want you to take one of these terms and seize it and make it yours. So that's the structure behind the poem. Like, if the poem is, if the term is parallax, which is like looking at something from different points of view, I said, okay, that's the title. Now you write the poem. You have to think about what experience, what is it you're creating in language from different points of view. Maybe it's a poem in sections then. Each section has a different point of view. So over time, and some ideas I had were disasters that I thought, oh, we'll just let that go. But the fun thing about teaching at the Institute and being the director was I was totally free to invent the entire program. So, and the other thing I did was start with contemporary literature for Native students and work backwards because I thought if it's a traditional college and you're reading Shakespeare to begin with, the Native students are just not going to relate, or if they're reading Milton or something. Um, but if they start with contemporary poetry, Native poetry, and work backwards, by the fourth year, I made them do a class in Shakespeare. And so then it was really fun to I had complete liberty to create what I wanted, and the crediting agency was really wonderful. I remember they told me, they said, Arthur, these are not your normal students. Invent whatever you want. If you can justify it, we will try and give you the accreditation. So that's how that happened. And here are a few writing prompts in the process.
Oh, wonderful. Do you teach anywhere now?
I don't.
You don't.
I'm
I think
74 and I
people
feel
are
like I want to
wondering.
just write. Yeah.
They want to sign up, but yes, I understand. And actually, what you said made so much sense to me because that's how I came into poetry with contemporary poets and relating to that, taking some workshops and stuff. And as time goes on, I've worked my way backwards
Right.
into some more historical poets, and I didn't appreciate them before, and I don't think I could have in the very beginning. So it's sort of a
Yeah.
brilliant
Interesting.
approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I have several more questions that I want to ask, but I do want to give a chance to have voice for some people from the chat. And Liz, do you want to select any questions from the chat
Yeah,
that have come up?
there's a couple that you guys, it's interesting, and I love when this happens because I've been reading the questions and your conversation has answered many of the
Oh,
questions that have already come up. But John Paul asked this great question. He said, I'm thinking of your Jaguar song and is asking if you could offer some pointers for handling personification and anthropomorphism with care. Which you do so brilliantly in this piece.
oh, thanks. I don't have any answers. I think obviously it needs when you pick, um, that creature or plant or bird or whatever, you have to feel some connection to it. So I had been thinking, for instance, about how with land development in the southern part of New Mexico and Arizona, developers had just bought up huge tracts of land and they didn't know it, but during the process of construction, as they were pouring concrete and creating new roads and stuff, they discovered at night jaguar tracks across the mud and stuff. And of course, jaguars don't care. It's Mexico, it's United States. They have their particular paths. And I started to think about that and how that kind of encroachment, how we do things and aren't fully aware how it's impacting, other species on the planet. And I thought, well, this might be really interesting. And the jaguar has personal interest to me because years ago, here's the connection to science. It looks like I'm rambling, but hopefully it comes back. I was friends with the Nobel laureate in physics, Murray Gell-Mann, who was working on a book on simplicity and complexity. And one evening, we became good friends. And one evening, he called me and he said, Arthur, I have the ideas, but I can't ever get the images. You're the poet. And I was reading this poem in River River, and you have a phrase, the quark and the jaguar. And Murray said to me, well, that's it. The quark, which Murray discovered and received the Nobel Prize for, is the image of the simple, of the elemental. And Murray said to me, and the jaguar that's in your poem, that's the quintessential image of something living and complex. Can I call my book on complexity, The Quark and the Jaguar? And I told Murray, of course, I'd be honored and thrilled. And so that happened. But so the image of the jaguar, and I don't know that I would have singled out the jaguar, except when I was reading about the jaguar prints showing up in this terrain with the developers. And then I thought of Murray saying, Arthur the jaguar is like the quintessential powerful living creature and an embodiment of complexity. I thought, oh, I need to give this a try and see imagine what the jaguar might say. And I guess my piece of advice is to not be in a hurry. As
Mm,
always, be willing to make a mess, not know too soon where you're going, to try and inhabit the voice of that creature or that species, and to try and give it urgency. I think we all, as writers of poems and readers of poems, we don't want to feel like, oh, we're just reading some artifact or something that's shallow. We want to feel like, oh, the poem commands my attention as a reader. It's saying this is important. It was necessary to be written. This engagement is important. So my suggestion is you feel that as you write, meaning don't worry about where the beginning is, where the end is. Don't be in a hurry, but make sure you feel some connection to what it is you're giving voice to.
thank you. There was another question from someone that was asking, they wanted to know more about the impulse and thought process behind the development of your cascade form.
Oh. So in an early book, River, I have a poem called Here, and I think it's like 17 or 19 lines, and each line begins with the word here. So that is obviously a classic poetic device to start every line with the same poem. And I thought, well, I've done that. It's a little predictable, but I love the idea of musicality, the sounds that we use in English, the silences, they're all so crucial to the music of the poem, to the power, the rhythmical power. And I thought, well, I'd like to repeat words or phrases, but I want to see what would happen if a certain word got picked up again and again. So my process was like in writing The White Orchard. The reason it took 88 drafts to come to that form was I was just writing monostichs, the one-line stanzas, the microcosms. And I had them on pages and I couldn't sort of see them. So then hopefully this is giving you ideas for your own writing practice. I printed them out and I cut them out with scissors and I put them on my desk and I moved them around and I had white lines with nothing written. And so I moved the lines I'd written, and some I thought these just aren't good enough, and I put them to the side. But I started to sift the lines that I thought were the most interesting, that maybe I didn't quite understand, but I could feel emotionally and imaginatively that there was some life or fire to it. And I started to move those into place, and I would move them around. And then I would move, this is my secret is white strips of paper with nothing on them. This is so Asian, right? And I would put them between lines I'd written. And then I would think, oh, what if instead of thinking I go from this line that's written to this line that's written, there's a line in between that's a bridge between the two lines. And that line contains a word from the line already written and contains a word that will be in the next line. So it's not just, it's linguistically, syntactically a bridge because that language repetition is there, but also sort of thematically, I had to think of what could be in that empty space. And so for me, it became a very long, drawn out process of trying different lines, rejecting them, adding others, and eventually through 88 drafts, then this poem came together. And I thought, oh, well, each line picks up a word or words from the previous line. Someone, I think it was Eileen Tavios who interviewed me, said, Arthur, you have to give it a name. And I thought, I don't know what to call it. And then I thought, well, I'll call it a cascade because there is a kind of flow or drop down from one line to
Right.
the next.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so
Hey, I
much.
feel like we're getting an education
Oh,
here. And
everybody in the chat is like, where can I sign up?
yeah, right. I also wanted to ask you about another form that you call the sequence. I think you call it the form of our time. And they tend to be long, so I don't think you chose to read one of the ones in the
Right.
book, but they're wonderful in a sort of different way, but similar to that cascade idea. Could you talk a little bit about the sequence?
Yeah, the very first sequence I wrote is in a book called River River. It's the opening poem. It's called The Leaves of a Dreamer, The Leaves of an Onion. And I actually, so I'm trying to think, I was about 35 then. I was at a stage where I'm backing up, but hopefully these are all interesting digressions. I mentioned I came out of translating classical Chinese poetry, and those poems are very short, compressed, beautiful, and those were that was my kind of model early on to write something concentrated like that. And then I got to the stage where I felt like it's too claustrophobic, it's too precious. I need to break it apart. I need to be able to put more of the world into the poem. The ancient Chinese poems, to me, become claustrophobic when you start to look at how constricted the vocabulary is. For instance, it's river, it's moon, it's wine, it's flower, it's, certain talismanic words are repeated again and again. And there's a power to that, and there's also that limitation. And I thought, yeah, I want to be able to put cork in a poem, or scissors, or bathtub, or, parallax in a poem, but I don't quite know how to do that. So I was struggling with this idea of, well, how do I make the poem grow or be something much larger or more ambitious than a poem written in 20 or 25 lines that's like a Tang Dynasty, ancient Chinese poem. And I thought, well, one way is to break it apart and break it open, that fracturing, which would allow for fragmentation. But as I was working on The Leaves of a Dreamer, The Leaves of an Onion, I had 3 poems that I had written that I thought they were all 18 to 20 lines long, and I thought they were all done. They were separate. And one day I laid them out on the floor. I'm sharing a lot of my creative process secrets with you. I hope that's okay. Sometimes I'll lay poems out on the floor and I'll put blank pages now instead of blank strips of paper, blank pages. And I put the 3 poems down and I thought, wait a minute, this really could be something larger. They're in conversation with each other. I wrote each one thinking that was a complete poem, but they were written within like 4 or 5 months of each other. And I thought, and had some blank sheets down. I thought, wait a minute, if I have these 3, but they're not 1, 2, and 3, maybe they're 1, 3, and 5. What would poem number 2 look like? Or what would poem number 4 look like? And then I realized as I started working that, well, poem 2 doesn't have to have the same voice as 1. It's a separate poem. It could change place, it could change time, it could change form, structure. And that was really exciting for me to then think, okay, I'm sort of in this arena or field of energy again. What if I give myself plenty of time and see if this is something that becomes 5 poems or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9. So then eventually sequences started to happen for me, and I could feel instinctively, I could tell that I'd written a poem in like 18 lines, but or 20 lines, and instead of feeling that was done, I felt like, oh, I'm just getting started. This is just like an iceberg, the beginning of something much larger and deeper, and I can't see what there is below the surface. Then for me, that was like, oh, this is where a sequence is at work. There's something much larger. And in my later sequences, I have sections that can't stand alone as poems. They're like shatterings or fragments, but they're all thematic threads that are important to the larger piece. So over time, my idea or my conception of the sequence changed, where instead of writing, in that first one, there were like 6 separate poems standalone poems, but they were in conversation. And then 10 years later, I'm thinking of or decades later, a poem like The Unfolding Center in 11 sections. I think that's the longest poem I've written. And there are different voices, there are different places and times, and parts of them are very fractured and parts are very coherent. And there's a much more ambiguous but kind of spontaneous structural flow, almost like jazz, I'm thinking, where you might hear certain melodies and think, that just sounds dissonant or out of place. I'm thinking of, like, say, Thelonious Monk. You hear these phrases, they just sound weird or odd or dissonant. But then if you listen again and again and again, you feel like, oh, these earn a place in that piece of music. They might sound dissonant or fragmentary at the time, but they're exactly, he knows what he's doing. These are exactly the sort of pieces, the building blocks, the shards that are essential to the piece at large. So for me, the sequence is a really rich arena of exploration where I can be very expansive. I can change place or time. And in a way, maybe it's more cinematic too, in the way you can work with film and flashback or changing place or location, but changing tone and voice. And so for me, that's an endlessly rich area to explore.
Oh, you've given us so many insights into your practice and we get to see into your writing studio too.
Right. Right.
Isn't that wonderful? That's great. And do you know other poets that are using the sequence? I mean, I certainly see other poems that are broken into sections, but I think the way you've described it is quite unique.
I mean, there's so many poets writing in sequences and writing beautifully in sequences, and sometimes book length, and sometimes just a poem. I'm thinking of, like, say, C.D. Wright, and a book like Deep Step Comes Shining, which is uniquely her own. She doesn't sound like anyone else, but and that sense of idea of, it's been said it's like driving around the deep south. And I think yes and no. I mean, I can pick out particular locations, maybe like Rome, Georgia, but I can't say there's any coherent linear map. To me, it's like a journey of discovery. And it's the way those phrases are musically put together. I've never written a book length sequence. I've written sequences where I get to a certain stage and then I feel like that's it. And if I keep going, I'm really just extending it, or I'm doing it out of wanting it to be longer. But I have difficulty thinking of a sequence as a book length piece, because then I start to think about, oh, well, it's a project, it's a structure. And then that gets into, it inhibits my ability to explore and discover. And when I don't know how long it is, that's very freeing for me. If I feel like, oh, well, this is a book idea, then I sort of like get tense. It's like, oh no, now what do I do? So again, there are so many poets working beautifully in sequential forms. And I would say, to each his own. More power to you.
Well, it sounds like you have a little bit of a rebel in you.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, and then I'll turn it back to Liz, but you bring in a lot of science. You mentioned one of your prompts, I think, to the students was using that book, Conceptual Astronomy. But I think it's wonderful the way you bring in technical terms, and I know you started your career at MIT in the sciences, um, and I don't believe that there's a separate world for scientists and a separate world for artists, but you've brought them together with a sense of awe and wonder. And I just wonder if you would talk a little bit more about how you do that and how you think about that.
Where do I start? I guess I want to start by saying, oftentimes art and science may be thought of as antithetical, as very different and with very different values. But in the 1980s, when I was friends with Murray Gell-Mann and another renowned physicist, George Zweig, I met them really by accident because I was working as a poet in the schools in New Mexico, all over the state. And one of the coordinators, Helene Slansky, used to have these dinners, and her husband, Richard Slansky, was the head of the theoretical physics division at Los Alamos. So imagine a bunch of poets and scientists showing up. I was someone who could actually bridge that gap, so I could sit down with Murray and I could understand what he was saying, and likewise with George Zweig. And one of the wonderful things I discovered was, for those scientists, there is also this incredible humility, the sense of excitement at discovery, and sort of endless mystery, that we know these few things, but there's so much we don't know. And that sense of discovery was something that united the art and science. And so, yeah, I like to think that there is no word in the English, you should be able to use every word in the English language in a poem, and again, here's my rebellion to classical Chinese poetry, which is so nature oriented and beautifully done. But again, road, river, mountain, blossom, peach blossom, that kind of moonlight, to be able to use not just words from other disciplines. And I'm thinking not just science, but for instance, a lot of weaving terms, a lot of mushroom hunting, ecology terms are in my poetry, but not just the vocabulary, but also maybe more importantly, the ways of seeing or exploring or being in the world. So George Zweig once at a dinner said to me, and it's in one of my poems, I had to steal it, I couldn't, it was so wonderful. He said, Arthur, the most important thing about 20th century particle physics is the question, where does matter end and space begin? And he said to me, people thought the atom was solid, and then it turned out to be hollow. There was a nucleus, and electrons traveled in these shells and these orbits around the nucleus. And then people thought the nucleus was the essential particle, and then it turns out there are protons and neutrons inside the nucleus. And then they thought that was the elemental particle, and then it turns out there are quarks inside of the protons. And so I laughed and I said, well, it's like this onion, you peel and peel and peel, and then there's nothing left in your hands. But when George said to me, oh, where does matter end and space begin? That's in a poem of mine called Before Completion. It's the opening sequence to the Glass Constellation. And that idea of where does matter end, where does language end and space or emptiness begin or silence begin, helped me think about how to orchestrate silences, the empty spaces inside of a sequence. I mentioned that the first sequence I wrote was The Leaves of a Dream, which is 6 separate poems, and there you see them as poems. But what happens when a section in a poem has syntactic phrases that are incomplete and they're just floating or hanging there, and there's white space in between? Yes, it's disorienting, but hopefully that sense of disorientation is a first step toward then later re-seeing or re-envisioning what's possible. It's like when you see something new or experience something new, it's like, what's going on? I'm disoriented. I think that can be an important early stage to responding to a poem. So I'm wanting to be able to use anything and everything. I am a mushroom hunter, and I studied for 5 summers with the head of the New Mexico Poison Control. My son and I, he's now, in his 40s, but when he was growing up, he had an interest in mushrooms, and it was a great father-son thing to do together. We would go out Saturday mornings in this class with a naturalist. We'd go up to Santa Fe Ski Basin, into the Jemez Mountains. And at first we were just collecting mushrooms and had no idea whether they were poisonous or edible, and we'd lay them out on a picnic table, and Bill Isaacs would say, oh, here's an early stage of a Boletus edulis, and he'd, show it. And over time I would learn different terrains go with different mushrooms, like boletes grow with spruce and fir. If you want to find them in New Mexico, you've got to be up at 10,500 feet. If you're looking at 7,000 feet, you'll never find them. If you want to find the white Boletus sperosii that grows under ponderosa pine, then you want to be at around 6,000 to 8,000, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet, but not too high. So it was like learning how to look at nature, learning ecologically these terrains, and all of that fed into my poetry. So I guess I feel like it's endless learning, and yeah, I just want to keep doing that.
Endless learning and endless discovery, and that open curiosity and mind, and such generosity. Liz, maybe you choose one or two questions from the chat, and then I'd love to just close by hearing your voice again with a poem.
Yeah.
But
I've been scrolling through the questions and I'm trying to find the best ones, or not just ones that you haven't addressed. But there's this one that someone asked a wee while ago, that she was interested in. She noted that as you've discussed your poetry, Arthur, you've used the words urgency and necessity more than once, and she wanted you to address that.
Um, well, the antecedent is all the way back to Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet,
Yeah.
where I mean, I think everyone likes this. I'm not alone. Where the young poet is saying, I write these poems, they're not getting published. What should I be doing with them? And Rilke says, forget about all that. I can't tell you if the poems are any good or not. But a work of art is good if it's sprung from necessity, is what Rilke tells the young poet. And I really love that this isn't written just to say, oh, I published it in such and such a place, or it's come into being because it's coming from a deep place inside of myself, and it has this necessity or urgency to come into being. And I feel like, as a poet, I'm working with that. I think that sense that the poem, that language matters, that something is at stake in the poem really counts. And if you, as the poet, are doing that with using that kind of care and attention and love of language and experience in your poetry, it comes through. And if you're just writing something that's more manipulative or arbitrary, or can be flashy but is shallower, a reader's going to see that. A reader might not see it on the first reading, but maybe 5 or 6 readings back, a reader's going to say, oh, wait a minute, I've got it. I'm not that interested in it. Whereas if you've written something that has that kind of depth and urgency, a reader might first say, oh, I don't understand this at all, but there's something here, I want to come back to it. And
Right.
that's where that process of like the unfolding of the language and the depth, it takes time for that to happen. And so for me, those are key words, because I want to feel like our time is valuable, the reader's time is valuable, that the poems are not, we're not part of consumer culture here. We're trying to write something that genuinely is important, that adds to our culture and what it is to be alive at this time and place in history.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. So the last question, several people have commented on the library behind you, your library, and just and wondering like what are the books, what are the genres, but the question that I really love that Bruce Spang asked is, how do these books find their way into your poems, or do they?
Um, some of them do, some of them don't, I guess. And it's a complete medley. It's like Well, I'm trying to think. If you're looking here on the screen on the lower left, there are a bunch of translations of Chinese poetry on that shelf. And then on the far right, along on the lower shelf, are all books published by Copper Canyon Press. My wife laughs and says in her library, everything's alphabetical. She knows where it is. She's like, how do you know where the goddamn books are? Because they're all scattered and things like a weaving book, a pottery book, but I somehow know where they are. So if you ask me, I could like go through and pick it out, climb up the ladder and find it. But they're in clusters. They're in juxtaposed groups rather than alphabetical order.
I love that.
I do too.
I just want to say that every poem in this book is one that I want to come back to in that way, that I feel like I will get more with every reading of it. And for anybody out there who hasn't picked up Into the Hush yet, I thoroughly recommend it. And if you want to continue learning in this way, this generous way that you've taught us so much and shared with us so much, I think the essays and interviews in the White Orchard book are really an education in a way into poetry and the way you think about poetry, and some very adept interviewers that you included the interviews there. So I think Liz put the links in the chat, but recommend that you pick up both of these books. And so I do want to close with your voice and your reading. And so before that, I will just say thank you for such a generous conversation and reading, and such a delight in this Sunday afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for inviting me to be on the Poets Corner, and thank you all for being here. I think I'll read this short poem called Leafless. And just as a note, there's it's a blue-throated hill star. It turns out it's a kind of hummingbird that was recently discovered in the highland Andean mountains in Ecuador and Peru. You never know what ends up in a poem. Leafless. Sunlight strikes the leafless aspen branches, strikes the white picket fence, and as I look at highlighted edges, my eyes sting. Tufted grass stalks sway in the flooding rays, and in the poinsettia of this hour, I need some darkness to bloom. In this space, a snow leopard leaps among rocks, the rosettes of its fur a moving landscape. Its hunger scents the air. As I exhale, a blue-throated hill star sips from a chucaragua flower. A fly agaric pushes out of soil. A raccoon scampers backward down an elm. We are always running from and lunging to. When we stop, the eagle feather of this pause blesses. Before light of the shortest day lifts to the hills, it runs across my line of sight in widening gold. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording here.